Funny place, this Crescent, he said. What about the Talbot woman, for instance? And why does she lock herself away? What was Mrs. Dalton hunting for, the night of the murder? And why does he look like a whipped dog? Then whose prints are those on the chest? I've got an idea, I know, but it's probably too late to prove it. Certainly they don't check with those of the Lancaster family or the servants. Then again, does anyone in the Crescent suspect anyone else? You might know that. They're a secretive lot, but they know each other well and some of them are interrelated. Take Jim here, and I believe the Talbots are connected, aren't they? Mrs. Lancaster's first husband was a brother of Miss Lydia's, and of Mrs. Talbot's husband. I added hesitantly, I think Miss Lydia suspects that either Miss Emily or Miss Margaret did it. Did she say so? Not exactly. She said she supposed they'd stood it as long as they could. Now that's interesting. Stood what? The old lady was hard to get along with, I gather. Probably, but I don't think Lydia meant it really. She was dreadfully upset. Well, nerves with women are often like wine with men, they bring out indiscreet facts. However, I suppose there's a Mr. Talbot? And Jim gave me a real surprise when he said that there was. Although he may be dead now. He ran off when George was a baby, and has never been heard from since. It was pretty well hushed up at the time, and of course I don't remember it, but there was a miserable story connected with it. That was years ago. It was so utterly incredible to me that I laughed. To learn all at once that that crayon portrait had more than a head and shoulders, had legs to run away with and emotions to feel and resentments to drive it off. But nobody noticed me. Is that why she locks up everything and everybody? By George, it never occurred to me, Jim said slowly. It may be. Still, it's absurd on the face of it. It must be 25 years ago. Maybe 30. But Mr. Dean was apparently tired of ancient history. He asked me if Holmes was a hard sleeper and an early riser, to which I replied yes and no, and a little later on he explained to me, as I have said, the intensive method of search I had witnessed that afternoon. But they'll not find it there, he said. And added, whoever got away with that money was too intelligent for that. I left him standing by the fire, and Jim took me back to the kitchen door again. He was silent until we reached it, then with his hand on the doorknob he said, What on earth made you go to see Helen, Lou? I suppose, I didn't know about Mr. Dean, and I thought you needed looking after, I told him. Well, she's coming back. Not because it's her duty, she says, but because she doesn't want to miss anything. And with the memory of the utter bitterness of his voice in my ears, I got myself home somehow and into bed. As I went back, I could see that across toward Euclid Street the men were still at work with lanterns and electric lamps. They had moved considerably since the afternoon, and there was something sinister and ominous about that painstaking inch-by-inch search, and about the shadowy figures as they crept along close to the ground. Chapter 19. The second glove turned up the next day, but by the time it did we were too busy wondering about Miss Emily's adventure of the night before even to think about it. For it was that night, a Saturday, or rather at 2 o'clock on Sunday morning, that Miss Emily Lancaster ran out of her home and sought sanctuary in the Talbot house. Ran just as she was, in a dressing gown over her long-sleeved nightdress and in a pair of bedroom slippers, and stood hammering on their front door until George Talbot opened it for her. Just what had happened I do not know. Even now the Crescent can only largely surmise. I know that when I went back to our house at 1 o'clock I noticed that the Lancaster house, or such part of it as I could see, was still lighted, and that this surprised me. I know too that by the time I was ready for bed it was dark again. But I heard no noise, and I dare say I should never have known about that flight of Miss Emily's at all, had not George Talbot come the next morning to tell me. It was a Sunday morning, and breakfast is later that day.